On the fourth day of Drizztmas, that dark elf gave to me an evil matriarchy and Orientalism, a nemesis for slash fiction, a sentient crystal artifact as evil as can be. Cheers. Ho, 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 and welcome back to Drizztmas, this being the fourth day of Drizztmas when we travel back in time to the homeland of Dark Elves. Yes, this is the fourth day when we talk about the Dark Elf novels by R.A. Salvatore in publication order, which is why we are now coming to the Dark Elf trilogy, the prequels, which were published after the Icewind Dale trilogy, which we talked about last time. These focus exclusively on the coming of age of one Drizzt Do'Urden, who is a bit of a boring character, but also a very beloved character, and we'll try to find out why that is the case, and why that's actually a bit of a problem. Anyway, this book has 4.26 stars rating on Goodreads out of 87,900 and something ratings, so keep that in mind. A lot of people love this book and think it's actually good. They are wrong. They are objectively wrong, and they should actually sit back and think really hard about their life's choices if they still think that is the case as adult human beings. Just saying this up front. And now let's do the usual thing. I'll give you a quick summary of what happens in this book, then we'll talk a bit about the structure, and then we'll talk about all the stuff that's, how it does work as a Dungeons & Dragons tie-in novel, and then we talk about all the stuff that's wrong with it, sort of, as usual. So, let's do that. The summary. This book follows Drizzt's first 30 years of life, roughly, from his birth all the way to him fleeing his home city of Menzoberranzan. And it covers his, schooling, his growing up, his first experiences amongst the Drow, and so forth. It is split into 5 parts. The first one is about his birth, the destruction of a rival house, Drow house, in Menzoberranzan. At the same time, it then covers his education as a young Drow man. It then goes in the third part to him coming to, the academy where he becomes a fighter, and is trained there. It's a bit of a magic school kind of vibe. And then it moves on to him being a patrol drow that is patrolling and working sort of as a guard for the city, killing monsters, and then being sent on a raid to the bad and terrible surface to kill evil surface elves, and that's fun. Now, Drizzt is horrified. He does not really take action there. He actually saves an elven child. Put a pin into that. It will come back later in roughly the 12th or 13th day of Drizztmas, roughly. Anyway, he does that. That angers the Spider Queen, and then, rival houses try to kill Drizzt. His father figure and weapons trainer gets sacrificed to the evil Spider Queen. Drizzt kills 2 mages, gets his magical panther, and leaves the city. That's sort of the plot here. The larger part around that is, of course, that within Menzoberranzan, Drow society has all these different noble houses that are all jockeying for position, and, Drizzt being so cool really stirs up a lot of anger and envy and so forth, and people are trying to use what happened in the first chapter, or the second chapter, the fall of one of these houses that, House Do'Urden attacks that other house, and one survivor swears revenge, and then throughout the story, while Drizzt becomes cooler and cooler and cooler, his enemies gather and try to, actually attack House Do'Urden in revenge. They don't do that in this book. This may happen later on, but that's sort of what happens here. A lot of stuff is just set up, and it's very different from other Dark Elf, from the first trilogy in publication order, which is what we'll talk about now when we talk about structure. All right. As I said, the structure is 5 parts this time round. They are all once again introduced by some philosophical musings by our Big D, who does waffle on about how bad everything down here is, but it's really boring this time around. And, well, as I said, the first part is sort of the setup. It covers the fall of House De Vere, Drizzt's birth, the fact that he survives only because his elder brother kills his even elder brother, and thus Drizzt is no longer the third male child, and thus doesn't have to be sacrificed to the evil Spider Queen Lolth. We'll talk about all of that in a moment. Anyway, it covers him, learning how to be a poor boy child in an evil matriarchy, and that's basically part one. Part two then covers him learning to fight with his beloved weapons master Zagnafane, who is in fact his father, because, there's some interesting things going on. Once again, this is a matriarchy, and women are evil because they also just, switch out partners all the time, which is bad in a matriarchy, I guess. We'll come back to that as well. So it's mostly Drizzt learning how to fight, but also being a very good guy, whereas everyone else is capital E, evil. They're not in league with Satan. But there's a lot of venom going around anyway. My point is, that's part two. It ends with Drizzt being tricked into killing a goblin that is magically disguised as a drow to rub his innocence. Does it work? Of course not, because Drizzt is our special boy. And then he goes to the academy and becomes a fighter. And he's of course better than everyone else. He just gets tricked once because of his innocence and naivete. After that, he wins every competition all the time. Until we come to the last part, where he decides to not take part in the evil ritual that kind of introduces him to being a full drow, which is, as rituals go, pretty tame. Apparently, drow women have sex with demons, sort of, but luckily Drizzt leaves the room before anything can happen, and he remains innocent, or I guess at this point almost incel. We'll come back to that later as well. Well, that's part three. Part four then covers the whole combat stuff. It's Drizzt has been introduced to Guinevere. Part four is named Guinevere, so we get more of Drizzt really loving that cat, because that cat is just like him, an honorable hunter, because sometimes killing is apparently fine and sometimes it's not. And then, well, Drizzt always having these doubts about everyone being so evil and him being so special because he's not evil. And, yeah. Then they do that raid all to the surface to kill the evil fairies. They're called fairies here, obviously elves. But, they kill some. They just go and kill a bunch of people. Drizzt saves that child, and comes back. Which, yeah, I guess. And then they have to go on another mission to fight some evil gnomes. Well, they're not evil gnomes. They're gnomes, but everyone thinks they're evil gnomes because drows are drow, I guess. And, during that, the other mage makes a first attempt at killing Drizzt with a lightning spell. Drizzt survives. Drizzt meets the leader of the gnomes. We know he's important because he gets a bit of a point of view sequence there. His name is obviously a Belvar Disengulp, and we'll find out what that is. Am I the only person who thinks that Disengulp sounds like throwing up? Anyway, my point is, that poor Belvar gets his hands chopped up because drow are cruel and evil. Have I mentioned they're evil? And that's kind of the end of that. Part four then is all about, House Durden figuring out that someone else wants to actually destroy them, and they try to find out who, and while they're trying to do that by summoning monsters from the abyss, they obviously learn that someone fucked up, and that's why they won't get any information. They do some scrying, they find out that Drizzt did not kill the elf child, then they decide to sacrifice Zagnafane. Drizzt goes, almost dies because of stupidity. The Panther shows up, Guinevere shows up and saves him, despite the order to kill him. They become best of friends, go back and kill two mages, because mages are always incompetent. Drizzt goes back to his house, to his family, finds out that they've killed his daddy, so he just walks away, and that's the end. So let's talk about why this is so different. And I think this is the first part. See, the first three books, The Crystal Shard, The Halfling's Gem, and of course Streams of Silver, each are very well sort of good representations of what a Dungeons and Dragons game would feel like. They have like an adventure structure. People defend a city, or people go and try to find a dwarven mine, or people run after their captured friend to save their friend. These work as plots. This time round, however, we have a bit of a problem. See, we don't have a full party of heroes. All we have is Drizzt Do'Urden. So what we get instead of like, a role-playing game adventure retelling, what we get here is a coming-of-age story. And those are very different in structure and not representative of something that you would actually, play out at a table. They come with a lot of issues that we'll talk about in a moment. But that means that this is not necessarily doing a lot of good advertisement for the game of Dungeons and Dragons. It does still, of course, feature, it features the Underdark, where the elves live. At the same time, there was obviously the book Jaws of the Underdark was published, and there was even a box set for the city of Menzoberranzan, so you can play in that area if you feel like it. And of course, there's a bunch of monsters that show up that you can also include, stuff like the Hook Horrors, who are pretty cool, and Cave Fishers, who are also kind of cool, I guess. So there's that kind of stuff, but does sort of tie back to the Forgotten Realms or Dungeons and Dragons as a whole. But we've kind of reached the point where the Forgotten Realms, as written and published by a TSR, and the Forgotten Realms, as imagined and written by R.A. Salvatore, are diverging further and further. And one of these first bits is, of course, the evil elves and the good drow. See, if you remember the conversation I had with Liam, if you haven't, you should go back and watch it. One important aspect is that 15% of all drow, according to the book, the official source book, are good. Now, Menzoberranzan has 20,000 elves, so that means 3,000 of these elves are supposedly not evil. We only meet two who feel incredibly special. Now, you can argue that, sheltered young Drizzt, being 30 years old, hasn't had like a lot of chances to find other elves that are not evil. Zagnafane, however, the other good guy, has lived for 400 years, and he's apparently never met another good elf, which seems to be somewhat unrealistic. Now, of course, there are ways you can construct this. You can say that, well, they're the nobility, and probably all the good guys have been enslaved because they're part of the lower classes, and so forth. You can make all these arguments. I don't think they work particularly well because the entire idea of drow society, as described in this specific book, is very unrealistic in a lot of ways. It's where world building becomes a bit of a problem, or D&D rules and world building kind of collide in all kinds of bad ways. So it's not necessarily a good representation of the Forgotten Realms, but, and this is sort of the dark part, right? And why I mentioned the Goodreads ratings and so forth. These books are incredibly popular. So the image of drow elves, of dark elves, and the images of the Underdark, the representation happening in these books has overtaken the official source books by, published by people like Ed Greenwood, who kind of invented the entire thing, right? And that's a bit of a problem, which is why we need to pay attention to the specific choices that Salvatore makes when he diverges from the original setting, much like his very specific depictions of Kalimshan are a divergence from the source material in, the Halfling's Gem. So this is something I wanted to point out. Now let's look at another part that I think is a difference to the previous books. And this is the tone. See, there's a level of supposedly lighthearted humor slapstick humor mostly, and a very cruel form of slapstick humor in those first three books. There's levels of comic relief, Bruner being, annoyingly crude and whatnot. There's all of these things happening in that dynamic between these different characters. Yes, they all have like one specific facet, only one characteristic, and so forth. But there's tension between them. There's interplay there, and so forth. This is not the case in this book here. Everyone is evil except for Drizzt, who's a kid. And that makes for very, very poor interactions all over the board. And even in, the books where Drizzt has all his companions and friends, he's the most boring of the lot, because all he does is being stoic and suffering. And those don't make for really entertaining characteristics. And we'll talk about that in a moment, when we have to talk about the influences and the idea of Stoicism and so forth. So this book already has a bit of a problem. Then, of course, it supposedly deals with the evil dark elves, and they are evil. They constantly murder each other. They inflict all kinds of suffering and so forth. So this has a very somber tone. The problem is, Bobby Salvatore is not good at it at all. This feels like the high school gothic grimness, you know what I mean? And that's a huge problem of these books. Everyone is evil, so we have to get told that everyone has like an evil smirk or an evil smile. Every time someone has facial expressions, they get introduced by evil or malicious. And that then also gets, signal boosted more. See, Drizzt's mom is Matron Malice. Yeah, Malice. Maybe a book by John Gwynne is in fact a biography of her. I don't know, but it's there, and everyone is hanging out with spiders, and it's, as I said, it's as on the nose as everything else in these books. Only because these are evil and so forth, it deals with very mature, sincere, serious topics, which are not helped by this level of ineptitude. Now let's actually talk about Dwarf society for a moment, and then let's talk about the problem with Drizzt here. See, Drow society is matriarchal, and they all worship the Spider Queen Wolf, who is an evil goddess. Now, why is this a problem? See, basically, this is a theocracy, a fanatic theocracy that hates everyone else and sends groups to commit terrorist attacks out there against the surface elves because they are, indoctrinated to do so. And the question is, what kind of societies could be the potential model for that? What kind of societies have, committed a few terrorist acts at the time these books were written, in the late 80s, early 90s? How many theocracies can you think of at that moment? Because while, obviously, you could call the Dark Elves racist, and they certainly are, and very clear with, the indoctrination bits and pieces within the academy part of the book. I think the theocracy part is more important here. The Nazis, German Nazis are not the model, sort of the inspiration here. It's a different one, and I think that's unfortunate. I'm obviously talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran, who has had, well, we're not going to do too much into politics today, but that's certainly something you can see here, a fanatic theocracy that sends terrorists, and the 1980s, 1990s certainly had a lot of Islamic terrorism supported by Iran happening. Obviously, the next problem is that this is a matriarchy, which kind of makes it different, sort of, but the idea that there is an entire state full of cruelty that commits violence to everyone, that is built on worshipping an evil god, and its priesthood are all power-hungry women. That's not a good setup, because it leads to a lot of fundamental misogyny. See, the problem there is not that there is a hierarchy, and that hierarchies in general are a problem, gender-based hierarchies in particular. No, it is evil because it's women in charge and not men in charge. It's made very clear that that is the case by making, basically gender switching everything. Women are stronger and larger, almost deliberately evoking ideas, like insect-like ideas and qualities there with, the matron changing her partners to breed, and it's deliberately evoking these ideas in a way that all these things are evil because it's women doing it. It's not because the structure itself is evil, which I think is a bit of a problem, to put it mildly, because it does, these are still books written for kids, and kids learning about how being ruled by women is bad, without understanding that the problem is being ruled by a strict hierarchy in general. It's not a good look, is my point here. The same with the idea of a theocracy. See, it's not bad to have a theocracy. The problem is that it's the wrong theocracy in this world. It's Loth, who is evil. Now, obviously, this kind of is built into the Dungeons & Dragons system with its alignment system and so forth. The problem is, of course, no one decided that, that Drow had to worship only Loth. No one except Bobby motherfucking Salvatore, because in other D&D source books, they of course have a choice of gods and goddesses to worship. It's just in these books that suddenly all the Drow worship this one goddess. So we have a theocracy, a monotheistic theocracy that produces terrorists, and it's a matriarchy. Now, we can talk about how the idea of a matriarchy versus a patriarchy and the idea of men being emasculated does tie back into all kinds of Orientalist stereotypes, something that is reinforced by the mention that Drizzt, when walking through Kalimshan, who is also, which we talked about yesterday, being terrible Orientalist stereotypes, is reminded of his home in Menzoberranzan, because, the whole idea of bartering, of being corrupt and so forth. These are deliberate choices that Salvatore makes in writing these books, drawing these connections explicitly. And yeah, as I said, this makes the whole thing still really, really bad in a fundamental way. And once again, being, a choice that Salvatore makes that was not explicit in the Drows of the Underdark book or other Dungeons & Dragons material. Yes, Drow as Dark Elves have always had racist undertones, but Salvatore turns this like up to 11, or possibly even 12. We don't know. And that's, obviously problematic. The next part is, of course, the world-building part. Because, see, and this is something that comes with the territory of a lot of older role-playing games. Conflicts are based on morals in these games. Which means all the evil races attack the good races. Do they now need reasons like, I don't know, needing more space, needing resources? No, they just love to kill good guys because they're the bad guys. And this is very clear with the raid that the Drow, perform on the surface elves, on the elves in this book. They just go to kill a bunch of people and then walk back home. Now, I don't want to, draw attention to recent history with this, but it does have exactly that resonance. And I don't know, man. It feels unnecessary in that way, that it's based on something that is deliberately made up to make no sense, except for morals, which then means that killing bad guys is morally justified, which I don't think is a good lesson to teach or to learn. So that's what we have first and foremost. Let's lighten this up with something that I think needs to be mentioned. Salvatore has progressed a little bit as a writer between the first trilogy and the second trilogy in publication order. And the first part where this shows is, in fact, the set piece of the first two chapters, with especially the attacks on, House De Vere and Drizzt being born at the same time as part of the ritual. Yes, it's incredibly kitschy and bad in what he's writing about, but he does handle the skipping and shifting between these different viewpoints to showcase how these things are happening at the same time. He does manage to actually do that in a fairly competent way compared to previous books. So, yeah, maybe there is progress somewhere there in his craft, at least. Or maybe it's because he had more time writing these than he had with the first trilogy. I just wanted to mention this before we move on to all the other Stuff that is annoying. See, Drow society obviously makes no sense, and one interesting aspect here is that everything that happens in Drow society is only evil because the Drow do it. Yes, you have all these houses, noble houses, jockeying and fighting for position in some weird ranking. No one actually explains ever how this ranking does happen. Like, who sets these rankings? Is it like football? Do they have like matches and someone keeps scores and and so forth? I don't know. It's not explained. Apparently, you can just go and murder someone else, and then everyone just shrugs if you manage to do it properly, which, yeah, I guess it is a way to write a setting, write a game, but not necessarily one that makes for good novels. But it's all weirdly mechanic in a lot of ways, which I guess comes back to the idea of this being, a role playing game novelization. I just wanted to mention this one before now we actually talk about Drizzt, the Erden, and the problem, why people like him and why that is a problem. See, we talked about how a lot of these books are power fantasies. This one is no exception. It is actually annoying in levels that we would criticize in fan fiction, in written fan fiction. We would call Drizzt a Mary Sue or a Gary Stu or whatever. I don't want to use the terminology, but he's very much the self insert, or at least the one character you're supposed to identify with, and he's morally good, and he has passion and innocence, and he wants good things. He's also the best sword fighter ever. He could also have been the best mage out there if he wanted to, and everything he does, he surprises everyone. He's always top of the class. It's like, I don't know, man. It's incredibly bad, and it's interesting, especially with magic school settings being very popular again and again, and people criticizing a lot of these books often for it. Even with I haven't read it. I haven't read Fourth Wing, but a lot of people talk about like how it's unrealistic that the main character is so good at everything, and yeah, that is annoying. But it's been there forever, and Drizzt is one of the worst offenders, and Salvatore is one of the worst offenders in that area. Drizzt's superiority, moral, physical, and in everything else, superiority is incredible in these books. And that doesn't make for good conflict, doesn't make for good tale telling, because there is no real conflict in these books. Everything Drizzt does and tries, he succeeds at because he's just so good. Which means the conflict has to be a moral one about Drizzt's inner, values and worth. And that doesn't happen because Drizzt is, of course, always good, and he recognizes evil immediately. There is no real conflict. Yes, at the beginning he doesn't understand that Drow society is bad, but once he understands it's bad, he immediately decides that he has to leave because it sucks. There is no there is no conflict within this novel. And there's also no development. Drizzt is the same character at the beginning as he is at the end. He's just more sad and, 30 years older, but that's all. And that's a problem. He's incredibly static in that regard. But still, people love him, and people love this archetype for whatever reason, and it's something I wanted to look at quickly here before we end this for today. Why do people like Drizzt? Why is that a problem? I've often had this issue with characters in different other books. He's a bit supposedly the strong, silent type. He's stoic. He has suffered so much, but he doesn't show it. And he's protecting everyone. He's protecting people that are weaker than him because he is just so good at all of it. He's a very specific male role model, or not a role model, but a very specific male archetype, and one that is incredibly toxic. Other examples might be Anomander Rake in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, who does have at least some of the same characteristics in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's slightly different in the Carcanis trilogy, and this is obviously not a Malazan video, so I'll not go deeper into it. It's also that Steven Erikson is definitely a much more skilled writer when it comes to characters that, even though I find Anomander Rake grating. He's far from this bad. You might find a bit of it in Aragorn, who is supposedly the inspiration for Drizzt Do'Urden. You might find some of it in Elric of Melniboné, although he's obviously a subversion of a lot of these tropes. The fact is that Stoicism is one virtue that a lot of men and boys get taught. To not cry, to not show weakness, to take all the suffering and just, suffer through it, to be there and save everyone else and protect everyone else. This is obviously not a video on toxic masculinity in general and problems with masculinity today at large, but it has to be said that Drizzt is very much held up as a positive example how to be that type of man. It's obviously also incredibly chauvinistic because it means that he decides when to save and how to save, and obviously take agency from everyone he considers weaker than himself. Something that we'll definitely come back to once we have more interactions between Drizzt and, say, Catti-brie and so forth in later novels. It's just important to see that this is in there. The problem is, of course, that this character, for all kinds of reasons, is incredibly attractive to a lot of both male and female readers. There's the idea that if you could only touch that whole cold heart and help to fix these kind of people, this will make, everything right because they are strong and all of that. And yeah, down that road lies incredibly toxic relationships. On the other hand, for men, it also kind of means you kind of ignore your emotions. It means you show no weakness. It means you don't actually speak up against unfairness because you're supposed to take all of that in stoically. And it leads into passivity and potentially depression. This is exactly what is built into this. The fun, well, not fun, in a good way. The terrible thing here is that Drizzt is supposedly to be full of passion, but we don't see that in Drizzt's action. The only way we could signal that Drizzt is full of passion is that his lavender eyes, which are so special, they shine with an inner fire when he's fighting and it's angry. But that's the other thing. The only time they do that is when he's angry. Anger is the only emotion that he gets to show in any of these situations. He gets angry when he thinks that Guinevere is killed. He gets angry once again when he thinks that Guinevere is killed. Anger is the only emotion that he gets to show. And that's supposedly to be his main quality that differentiates him from all the other drow, his passion. I don't know. Teaching boys to be stoic and have only rage as their only emotion, what kind of society are you building with that? I don't know. Would it be a society in which men strive for roles of power and dominate everyone under them, showing them only rage if anyone, goes against their will? Would that lead into like a very specific form of violent patriarchy, maybe? Something that is exactly like what is happening in Menzoberranzan, with one important difference. This time it's men doing it. And they're doing it for the right reasons that are written down in books and say, these guys are good, not evil. I think the world is a bit more complex. I think you can take positive things out of this system. You can realize that hierarchies suck, that hierarchies that use a lot of violence and indoctrination to stay around suck in general, that gender doesn't actually matter in these affairs. It is the concept of a hierarchy that's the problem here. We can talk about how a theocracy is a really bad thing, and a theocracy that dictates the superiority of men over women is just as bad as a theocracy that would hypothetically dictate the superiority of women over men. A theocracy that tells men to subjugate women because they are lesser and they're there to serve them. Now that would be a really frightening and scary thing, wouldn't it? It would be evil, just like the matriarchy happening in this world. Guess what? We do have people who believe in that. We do, in fact, actually have religions who dictate that. Have you heard of something called evangelical Christianity recently? Think about it. And that's the fundamental issue. You can take this lesson out of it, but it's not telling you that lesson. And it needs a certain level of awareness, a certain level of critical thinking to realize these ways of reading the book. 14-year-old boys being told to not cry and to compete endlessly in sports or everything in school, they are in a system already. We are in a system that is scarily close to the endless competition happening in Menzoberranzan. We're in it. We won't be able to see that at that age. We need to be, kicked around by the world for a while. We need to be kicked around by life for a while. We should probably read some anarchist texts on the way. All of these things make it possible to read this book and take something sort of almost positive about it, out of it, in realizing how bad these structures fundamentally are. But that's not the target audience. The target audience is going to read this book and realize that all dark elves are evil because they have women telling the boys what to do. And boys have to be silent and strong and stoic and only show rage. And that makes them good. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's terrible. And the fact that this book has 87,900 something ratings and reviews, well, not reviews, but ratings on Goodreads with a 4.26 average is scary. It's really scary. And I'm not looking forward to talking about Exile tomorrow. Because just because Drizzt has, left Menzoberranzan does not mean he suddenly becomes someone who is, going to do community activism and turn the world into a better place. Nah, it's not that. Trust me. Anyway, I'll see you around for that tomorrow. Until then, I don't know. Go donate to a food bank. Do something else. Do community activism. And don't turn to the strong silent type that takes away agency from anyone else. It's toxic, and it'll hurt you just as well as anyone else. So, see you tomorrow. Until then, thanks and cheers.